All right, well, let's get things rolling. Um, Hi everyone. I just wanted to thank you for coming. Many of you are seasoned NaNoWriMo participants, but those of you who are new to the idea, NaNoWriMo stands for the National Novel Writing Month. And it's a community of writers who try to bang out a novel in the month of November. And by banging out a novel, it just sort of means you're trying to write about 50,000 words and hopefully carve out some sort of story, if at all possible. So we are in the month of October, which in Nano World we call Preptober. So we are very lucky to have John August come and answer a few questions. John is best known for writing screenplays, including Go and the two Charlie's Angel movies, the live action version of Aladdin, and many more, including one of my personal favorites, Big Fish. He also co-hosts the podcast Script Notes with his buddy Craig Mazin, and is the author of the Arlo Finch series for kids. Welcome, John August.
It's so nice to be here.
Yeah. So I read that you wrote the first version of Arlo Finch on NaNoWriMo. Is that true?
That's true. So if I can set the scene for you, this was back in 2016, and I was at the Austin Film Festival. So I was there to do presentations for the Austin Film Festival. And generally there's like events to go to, but it was a huge thunderstorm that whole weekend. And so it's kind of trapped in my hotel room. And I had a general thought of like, oh, I really want to do NaNoWriMo at some point. I have this idea, which really isn't quite a movie. It's not quite a series. I think it probably is a book. And it was during that time that I had a conversation with an author, a middle grade author, I was in conversations about adapting his book into a movie. And so in this hotel room, I had this good phone call with this author and talking to Kenneth Opel. And we were talking about sort of the book that I was going to talk about adapting. And I realized like, man, I don't want to like adapt his book. I want to write my own book. And so this was October 30th. This was Halloween. And I was talking to him. And then like, I was like, you know what? Maybe I should just do it. And so I spent a couple hours just trying to figure out like characters' names. So I'm going to recommend everyone figure out your characters' names, figure out sort of general things I need to know about going into it. But then November 1st, it's still in that hotel room, still raining. I started cranking out the first chapter of Arlo Finch, and I just kept going, and that became a book, and then it became a trilogy, and so I had to do 2 more of those the next 2 years, and it was a really difficult but great experience, and I really, really loved, especially those first couple of weeks, building out the first few chapters of Arlo Finch, and really seeing like, oh, this is what the story's going to feel like in prose form, which is not a thing I've written a lot of.
That's fantastic. I'm glad that NaNoWriMo gave you the opportunity to crank it out, and that you were able to really take advantage of the experience. And I'm kind of curious to know, when you first came up with the idea for Arlo Finch, was the first spark more of like an image or a character or a bit of dialogue? What was it?
It was really a setting. So I grew up in Colorado, and I was in Boy Scouts, and I spent all my teenage years and preteen years sort of out in the woods with my scout troop. And it was surprisingly like dangerous. Like we were very undersupervised, and we had knives and matches, and we're just doing all these things which feel really unlike what sort of most normal kids sort of get to do. And I always kind of wanted to write about that time, but I didn't really want to write quite a biography of it because it wasn't quite that interesting. But it felt a little bit magical. And so it was actually in the conversation I had with this author, Kenneth Opel, I learned what middle grade fiction is. And middle grade fiction is basically what Harry Potter is, or what Percy Jackson is. It's that, kids, the characters are kids, 8 to 12, 8 to 14. And it's read by kids who are age of 14, although a lot of times, like Harry Potter, they're really read by adults too.
Yeah.
And if you read through one of those books, it reads like, as at kind of an adult level. Like there's a little bit of a simplification, but it's not babyish at all. And I realized like, oh, this story that I've been thinking about telling probably could be a middle grade fiction novel. And I could tell sort of what really happened was sort of the heightened, somewhat magical version of this story. And that could be kind of great. And so I very classically took the central characters, kind of a slightly fictionalized version of myself, who's not really a leader, but a really good follower. And he was the sort of the central character. I put him in Colorado. I very much knew the environment I wanted to set things in this little small town. And then it's a matter of just like getting very specific and finding names for places, names for people, situations that are sort of setting things up, and getting started and finding the way to replace all of my memories of, Webelos and Scouts into sort of this more magical version.
Right. Now, I've heard you mention names several times. It sounds like names are something that's important to you, is it?
Names are incredibly crucial, and I can stop dead if I can't think of the right name for a person, because it embodies so much of that thing of who a person is. And so with Arlo Finch, I knew I wanted something that was short and memorable. My original last name was not August. It was Meise, which is a German last name. It's German for this little small bird. The closest equivalent probably to it is a finch. And so it's this bird is like a finch. And so I was thinking, so maybe this last name is Finch, and I needed to find something that would be a good match with Finch. And so I just auditioned names off of it. And so I knew it would be probably two syllables, like Blump Blump Finch. And so I tried through all those things and came across Arlo, and there was Arlo Finch sounded just right. So once I had him, I had to name the rest of the Finch family, make sure that there were no weird crossovers or duplications. I try never to have two characters with the same first letter in their names and choose central characters just because people get confused on the page. So I had to figure out JC Finch and sort of who the mom was, and his uncle Wade, and just basically building out the rest of the people around so they have all interesting, distinct names, and then really who are those people and sort of what do they look like, what do they feel like. I wasn't necessarily writing out the full descriptions at that point, but I was just trying to form an image in my head of who these people were. And that was all, honestly, October 31st choices I was making. I had a scribbled notebook and I was making up all these names. Because without that, I wouldn't know how to, I would be scared to start putting words in their mouth.
Right. Now, I've heard people say, write what you know. And sometimes that throws me for a bit of a loop, because maybe I want to write a story about, cyborgs, killing people with their laser pistols or whatever.
Yeah.
And, Arlo takes place in a make-believe world, kind of, where magic takes place and stuff like that. And so what do you take of the statement, write what you know? Because it sounds like, there's sort of a hybrid of things that you've experienced, but also some new ideas, maybe? I don't know.
For sure. I mean, I think the general advice I always give to people is like, write the book you wish you could read. So write the movie you wish you could watch, write the book you wish you could read, and be honest with yourself. Like, what book would you actually sit down and read? And so sometimes I find people will try to go into this project like writing a book that they themselves would not spend the time to read, and that doesn't feel useful to anybody. So within that bigger framework of writing the book you wish you could read, look at what experiences you have that could apply to this. So it doesn't mean like if you are a software engineer that it has to be about software engineering, but is there something about your expertise in terms of how you put things together, how you see the world, or like that traumatic thing that happened to you 15 years ago? We can draw from those experiences and pull them in, because all writing tends to be somewhat autobiographical. You're always bringing in your own experiences here. And so if you have experience about what it's like to grow up in a certain kind of dysfunctional family, that feels like prime material to bring into whatever project you want to write.
So as we get into the nitty-gritty of planning for our nano projects, it sounds to me like for this particular project, you sort of were thrown into the fire and just on your mark, get set, go.
Yeah.
But so for most of us, we sort of fall, there's no one way to plan for nano, obviously, but most of us fall into one of three categories. There's pantsers who don't plan a ton and just write by the seat of their pants.
Yep.
Famously, Stephen King likes to do this because, he likes to come up with characters who lead him on to some sort of journey, and he doesn't like to know exactly what's going to happen. Then there's plotters, who is someone who structures their story very carefully and outlines and builds characters very precisely, and they have a very predetermined ending. And authors like, J.K. Rowling and John Grisham like to do this because they feel like having strong outlines help them avoid writer's block and crank out their stories faster with a stronger arc. And then the third is a planster, which I guess is hybrid between the two, which obviously we're all somewhere on that sort of, we're all plansters to some extent.
Yeah.
But what about you, John? Are you more of a pantster or a plotter?
Yeah, so I would say on that spectrum, I'm more of a pantser in that I am sort of like, I want to see where the story goes. I sort of want to be an observer who's watching and let the characters really drive the action and take us to the next place. And that makes sort of sitting down each day kind of a discovery, because I'm not really quite sure what's going to happen. And that generally serves me pretty well. And I'll say that having written 50 movies, having written a bunch of screenplays, I do have a sense more of like where I'm at in a story and kind of what needs to happen. And structurally, that stuff, I'm much more familiar with that. So I'm more comfortable not having all the information going in, because I know how I will figure it out. I have sort of intuitive sense. So if a person does want to sort of do out the outline more fully, that can also work great. I just love that process of discovering new things as they're happening, and not really having a sense of like, okay, this chapter has to do exactly this, but to allow things to happen as they want to happen. That said, on the second Arlo Finch book, Lake of Fire, at some point I realized like, oh crap, I am screwed if I don't take 3 days and actually just plot out the rest of this book, because there's a really sophisticated time travel thing that's happening. And if I did not spend the time to actually make all those things work and connect, I would still be writing the book. It was going to just be impossible if I didn't sort of stop and go through it. I'm working on a graphic novel right now, and I'm at the stop and figure out point here, because with the artist who's coming on to do stuff, there's some changes that are going to ripple through. And if I were to just try to just keep forging forward and writing, there'd be a lot of wasted work.
Would you agree that that works good for you, but maybe someone else prefers to work in a different way? Or do you recommend giving it a try the way you're suggesting?
I think you're going to have to experiment. And I think, one of the most crucial things is not to judge yourself or blame yourself if you're doing something that's not the way that the other people are doing it their way. I think my only caution would be that if you feel like you're a plotter outliner, great. But I see people sometimes get trapped in their outline, or they get trapped that they have to do this thing, and they're holding themselves to the structure that may not actually be interesting for them to work every day. And so whatever it takes for you to sort of be excited-ish, not perfectly excited, but excited-ish enough to sit down and actually do that day's work is really crucial. And if the outline is going to help you do it, great. But if you're 3 days in and you realize I don't like the story that I outlined here, for NaNoWriMo, at least, I would say follow that instinct and maybe write away from the outline and write sort of where the story is carrying you, because that's probably going to be more interesting than what you thought going in.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. I think that it is important to be really passionate about and excited about your story. I think for a lot of writers, we have a lot of competing ideas in our head for stories. And I imagine that you are as well. And I'm kind of curious to know, how do you know which of those ideas are maybe the most worthy?
I would say the advice I often give is pick the story that has the best ending, because that's the one you'll actually write through to the end. Because it's really easy to think of what we call inciting incidents, sort of the beginnings of stories and sort of the setups. The resolutions are less common but really much more meaningful in many ways. And so think about the ones that has a great ending. And if you have a story that has a great ending and a great beginning, you're likely to actually write the whole thing. That's not to say the middle parts are going to be easy, because they're not. But you'll have a sense of where the story wants to go. And so even though I say I'm a pantser, I do have a very good sense of pretty early on, I knew that in Arlo Finch, we were going to start here and we we're going to get to this point, and this was going to cover this period of time. I knew it was going to be a winter book. I knew the kinds of things that were going to happen in this book versus a future book. And I knew sort of the boundaries of things. I think that's really important to sort of know the edges of your frame before you start. The edges of your frame of the book, but also sort of sections or chapters. Getting a sense of where those boundaries are is incredibly helpful.
Do you think it's helpful for writers to sketch out character ideas or plot ideas or themes? Any of those things?
Yeah. So let's start with themes first. Themes is one of those, the idea of a theme is one of those kind of English class things that it's hard to necessarily recognize when you're in the middle of writing a story or you're about to write a thing. So you might ask yourself some questions about the story that are interesting to answer, but you'll probably not discover your themes until you're pretty well into it. But there's really more concrete things that you should be working on here in October, which is who's your hero? What does your hero want? What's driving them? What's in the way of what they want? Really asking those sort of basic fundamental questions about characters' motivation and drive is really important. Then get details about sort of, where are they living? Who are their friends? What do they do, on a given afternoon? Some people like to do those full-on bios of stuff that goes through everything about a person. That's not my style, but if that works for you, great. If it helps you think about things, great. If you want to sort of, I'm a big fan of like writing kind of off the page, like things that don't necessarily need to fit in, but like, what would a conversation be like between this character and the other character, or one of their best friends? Like, what kinds of stuff? What does their voice sound like? Is great. Same thing with whoever your villain is, or whoever the antagonist is. What do they want? What are they after? How can you make them feel like they're actually a real three-dimensional human or alien who has an agenda that makes sense? And that's great stuff to be figuring out here in advance. And then if your world has rules, if there's some science fiction rules or some fantasy rules, figure out what those are for you. And you may need to put them in fully in the book, or you may just need to sort of give us a sense of the outer edges of what those rules are going to be. But great to have some of those thoughts done now before you get down to the actual writing of chapters.
So for like a main character, you're saying that it would be great if you had jotted down some ideas about what that goal was, what they want, and then and that to me
things like what are they with what they want, like what are they afraid of, what do they hate, like what are some things that are specific about them that keep them from being every other character in every other story you've read.
Right. And then so some people talk about the plot as being like the outer journey, or I don't know how to word it exactly, but then there's also sort of the inner journey that the main character often goes through.
Yeah.
And that applies to what sometimes is called like the fatal flaw or the misbelief or whatever like that. Do you start thinking about that early on, or is that something you sort of discover along the way?
I generally discover that along the way. With Arlo Finch, I kind of discovered it along the way, but I definitely gave myself runway so the character could grow and change over the course of it. Usually in books and in movies, this is a journey the character is going to take just once. They're going to start at a certain place and they will get to a certain place. They could physically move, but hopefully, as you're describing, they have a growth of their character. They are able to do something at the end of the story that they couldn't do at the beginning of the story. And so with Arlo Finch, that's pretty obvious because he's coming into this environment. He knows nothing about what's going on. He's having to learn the rules of this Rangers group, but also the kind of magic that Rangers do. And he can't do any of it. And at the end, he can do something that's really impressive. And that is an outward manifestation of sort of how much he's changed. But he's also gone from being this incredibly meek wallflower to actually stepping up and taking some ownership of this patrol that he's in, and sort of building friends around him and trusting people. So you see that he's been able to grow. And did I know exactly where he'd get to by the end of the book? No, but I did know that I was giving him a place to escalate. I was giving him room to grow.
Now, how do you specifically organize these ideas? Do you like write them down somewhere, or do you make cards, or what do you do?
For Arlo Finch, it was just like a page in a notebook. It was really, really sketchy. And I didn't do very full work on that. For the second Arlo Finch, when I needed to actually outline everything, I was just using an outliner, one called Workflow, that would actually sort of like would work through sort of like, okay, these are the chapters. Here's what needs to happen. Here's how the time travel is going to work. I did have like little charts and diagrams for how this was all going to fit together, and like literal maps to figure out like how they could get from point A to point B, which became maps that were actually printed in the book, because I always wanted a book that had a map in it, and so I had a book with a map in it. But when it came time for organizing the writing itself, and this is sort of like when November started, one thing I would recommend people think about is, if you're writing the kind of book that could have short chapters, and a lot of books can have short chapters, consider keeping each of the chapters separate rather than just one long document. Because the thing you'll find that you're going to do is you're going to want to go back and rewrite that, from the start, and just because it's much easier to rewrite than to write new stuff. But if you write each chapter as a separate file and you're just starting kind of fresh on a thing, you can really focus on, okay, this is today's work, this is today's chapter, here's where I need to go. And in that new blank document, what I'll often do is do what we call synopsis lines in the app I use called Highland, which are just basically bullet points. Like, these are things that need to happen. This is like the very basic framework of this chapter, this scene, this moment. And then you can get started in terms of like who says what and how we're getting through those, and getting those sentences to fit well together. But having some sense of like, today's work, just got to get this done. And it feels so good when you can finish a day's work and it's like, oh, this chapter is all new just from today. And you won't always get that to happen, but it's so gratifying when you can get a full chapter out in a day.
We have a question from one of our participants, Adam.
Sure. John, loved the podcast about the book. Was curious, how school tours and interacting with your readers has changed since COVID?
I did a lot of school tours for Arlo Finch when it first came out. So I did, for people who haven't written middle grade fiction, when you have a book come out, so the first book, the second book, the third book, you will go on a tour to a bunch of elementary schools and sometimes junior highs and talk about the book. And so it could be a classroom of 30 students, it could be 300 students at times, and you will give a presentation, and then you will sign a bunch of books, and then you'll go on and do like 2 or 3 more of those in a day. It's so exhausting. It's really fun, but you just become a person who's like on a treadmill just doing this thing, and you have no idea kind of where you are. You're just a person who gives this presentation. I liked it. It was a lot. Luckily, I finished all of that work before COVID hit, so I didn't have to do the Zoom tours of stuff. So I visited a couple schools on Zoom tours, and given a version of my same presentation with COVID. From what talking with other friends who've had books come out since, it's getting more back to normal, where they are they'll travel to a city and hit 3 schools in a day and give those presentations. But that's very sort of unique to middle grade or younger fiction. Sometimes picture books will do those kinds of things. For YA and above, you don't do those kind of things. At most, you might do some bookstore visits or podcast visits, which you can sort of do from home.
One of the great things I think about NaNoWriMo is that it gives you an opportunity, us writers, to establish writing as a daily habit. Because a lot of authors say that, it's a good idea to be writing every day. Do you have any tips for making writing a habit?
Definitely. If you can have a routine where you can block off a certain amount of time, it's like, this is my writing time, that will help you a lot. So it makes it much more, regular. Like, this is the time that I don't have to do it, that I get to do it. Like, recognizing that this time is a privilege, that you get to do this one thing, which for me, it was like, this writing was so different from everything else I was doing. It did feel like a treat that I got to do this thing. Was it always delightful? Did I love it? No, I didn't always love it. Sometimes it was a lot of hard work and sort of slog to get through, but I recognized that this was a special time I got to do a thing. The other thing I would really recommend people consider is what I call sprints, which is just like, you set a timer for a certain amount of time, and like, during this time, I'm just going to work on the book. no internet, nothing else, not checking emails. I'm just working on this. So for me, I tend to set a 1 hour sprint, and I will sometimes post on Twitter like, hey, I'm starting a writing sprint at the top of the hour. It's like, 10 minutes before the hour, like if anybody wants to join me. And there's some public accountability, but also that sense of like, I'm not doing this all alone. I've sort of said like, this is just the time I'm doing it. And so I'll write for that hour. In Highland, the app I use, I'll set the little writing sprint timer, and then it'll beep when it's done, and I will get up and walk away from it. And I find that if I'm doing 2 of those in the course of a day, I can always generally hit my word count, and that feels great.
Yeah. So I know that there are a lot of tools and books out there to help writers plan their stories. I'm curious to know, I know that you've created a writer's emergency pack, and there's a new version of it on Kickstarter right now. What can you tell us about that?
Great. So Writer Emergency Pack, this is the original Writer Emergency Pack. We did a Kickstarter for this 2015. And this was just basically for like when you get stuck as a writer. And so it could be when you're in the middle of a scene. It could be like as you're plotting stuff out, you draw a card. It has a fun suggestion like this is Secret Society. And then you look, and so it says Secret Society, the hero has stumbled upon a dark conspiracy, or perhaps they've been part of it all along. And so you think about, okay, so what would a secret society be like in my story? And so for Arlo Finch, I can think of a secret society. Like, what is the opposite of the Rangers? What's going on there? And then with each one of these, we also have sort of a detail card that sort of goes into sort of more detail about secret society. So it says, secret societies aren't just for thrillers from Alcoholics Anonymous to Girl Scouts. Every group has goals, rituals, and inside knowledge. What is your hero trying to get in or get out? Whether it's an ancient fraternity, a midnight bowling league, or the house down the street with strange noises, secret societies provide your hero a chance to enter a hidden world or escape a nightmare. And then on the back, some tips. And for example, like list rituals or practices that are special to that group. And so for something like Arlo Finch and the Rangers, I can think of like, okay, well, I know all the rituals from Boy Scouts, but what would the equivalent things be like that for Rangers? Like, what is the special cool stuff that we can do there? And like, that's great. And so if I was in the middle of a chapter that was kind of stuck in, and I had my Rangers, like, okay, well, what's a cool ritual that Rangers could have that could sort of be an interesting thing to bring out at this point? And so like, there's a bonfire ritual that Rangers, that becomes a big important point in the first book. So that was the original one. We have a Kickstarter for the new version, which is the same deck, but with twice the cards, and they're bigger. And this one has, so this is in plain sight. It's always the last place they look. And the big advantage to the new one is that it's just one card back and front. And so it's just a little bit easier. So in plain sight, example is show a character seeing someone else in a new light. A slight change on the outside reveals what was inside all along. So like, what's a way you can show that character in a new light?
John, we're going to put the Kickstarter link on the comments page.
Oh, great. Thanks.
And I understand that there's a tie-in to NaNoWriMo. Is that correct?
Since 2016, we've been partnered up with NaNoWriMo. So in addition to sort of the National Novel Writing Month for everybody and adults, there's a program called Young Writers Program through NaNoWriMo. And Young Writers Program is partnered up with a bunch of classrooms across the US and Canada. And they send out these sort of kits to classrooms, grade school, but also some junior highs, really focusing on sort of like writing in the month of November. And so in every one of those kits is a Writer Emergency Pack. And so as part of this new Kickstarter, we'll be able to send one deck to classrooms for every deck we send out to backers on Kickstarter.
Yeah, and there's only a few days left on the Kickstarter campaign, so I urge everyone to jump on as soon as they can.
Absolutely, we're fully funded, so it's definitely going to happen. And we just announced today that the dark mode version of the deck is also happening, which is really
congratulations!
Cool. So,
that's awesome. All right, well, let's transition to some questions that anyone here wants to ask John. Anything specific?
Madeline has a question.
Hi, John. I'm curious on if you find a difference between your voice for screenwriting and for prose or novel writing, since they are such different forms. And if so, how do you transition between those different voices?
That's a great question. And I think one of the things that was, as I was first started looking at middle grade fiction writing, is I realized that my scene description voice for screenplays is actually very much like my middle grade fiction voice overall. And that I think it's approachable, it's fun, and it reads actually very much the same. So if you read any of the scripts that are up at my library, so johnoggs.com/library, you can read through the scripts for things I've written, and like the voice is actually very similar to my prose voice. What I did, of course, the big difference between screenplays and books is that in a book I can talk about the texture of the sheets, I can talk about smells, I can talk about all sorts of inner states of a character that I just can't do in a screenplay. So screenplay is only what you can see and what you can hear. And I love the ability to sort of just use more senses and actually sort of get inside characters' heads more. One of the things you're always have to think about as you're writing your NaNoWriMo project is really point of view and perspective. And so often we write in the third person perspective. So we're an observer watching something, although some other books are written in first person and even some second person books. Middle grade fiction tends to be written in a very close third person perspective. And so for the Oliver Finch books, it's like the observer is like right over Arlo's shoulder. You basically only know what Arlo knows and people around him. And only in the second book do I break POV for specific reasons to show what's happening outside of Arlo's point of view. So you're always going to be thinking about that. Screenplays, though, of course, are objective POV, like you are the camera. And that's why one of the main reasons why movies and books tend to work so differently. And when you look at an adaptation of one of your favorite books as a movie, the shift in POV is part of what's really changed in that adaptation.
Another question, R.L. Platt wants to know if you use a specific program to write your stories or just a Word document.
So people should use whatever they want to use for it, and don't get too hung up on whatever software you use. For me, I write everything on the Mac in Highland, which is an app that my company actually makes. It's a free download on the Mac App Store if you want to check it out. I used it for screenplays, and it was really designed originally for screenplays, but it's worked great for books too. And some of the things I like about it is that it's just really light under your fingers. There's not a lot of formatting sort of getting in your way. Whatever app you use, I really strongly encourage you to sort of don't think about the typefaces and stuff. Don't try to make it look like a finished book. Just focus on the words, because that's all you should be focusing on as you're starting to do these stories. And down the road, you can worry about manuscript format or whatever else. For now, just words, and whatever helps you focus on that is what you should be using for your app.
Great. Can I ask a question? Shelby from Thousand Oaks wants to ask, do your first drafts have a lot of plot holes and wandering scenes that go nowhere, or is that just me?
It's not just you. It's a really common experience, and it's something that you get much better at with time. What you shouldn't worry about at this point is like, while you're writing, don't freak out about those things. Focus on like making it read really well on the page, making sure you're engaged. Then you can go back and do that cutting. Over the years, I've become I'm like one of those cabinet makers who can sort of eyeball something and like I can make all the cuts and like it'll just fit there perfectly the first time. But that's only through experience. And the initial things were always huge and unwieldy because you're just getting used to the form. You're getting used to like how storytelling works, how prose works. It takes a while. So don't worry if you're overbuilding originally. You'll get better with it in time.
Great question. Adam has another question.
So as someone who writes a lot of stuff for young audiences, and I do as well, but time has taken me farther away from young audiences somehow. Besides having kids, how do you keep authentic youth voices, or is that something you prioritize when you don't have, you don't interact with them much?
I'm going to be honest. I didn't worry so much about like, does it sound authentically young? I think we all kind of remember what we kind of remember what the speech. We kind of remember how we were young. but I didn't worry about sort of like, am I hitting exactly the lingo of this group of kids, because it didn't kind of matter for the books I was writing, because they were in this Colorado mountain town, and they felt isolated, and it felt like it could have happened kind of in any decade. So it wasn't a big factor for me. I will say that overall, I try to just be a little bit aware of where language is moving and where language is drifting. Teen girls and young girls are the main drivers of language. So if they're doing things that are specific and interesting and new, it'll happen there first. All that said, hopefully you're writing a book that's going to be on the shelf for 20 years, and it probably is a good idea if it's not be so specific that it feels like, oh wow, this is exactly the 2022 book, and it won't make any sense 3 years later.
Very good. So we have another question submitted by Doug T. He writes, I love plotting out my stories, but at the end, I find they sometimes lack heart.
Yeah, and that can happen. And so what I would say is, like, really, what is emotionally interesting to you about the story? And it's really easy for things to be mechanically and intellectually interesting, and like, that you're tackling interesting ideas. But is there do you have an emotional connection to the story, to the characters? Where are you in the story, and what is scary or exciting or thrilling, or just like, who are you in there? Because you have an emotional relationship to yourself, and figure out who you are in the story, and I bet you'll have a better chance of finding a real emotional connection to it. It's also scary sometimes to sort of have an emotional connection to things. Big Fish was an incredibly emotional experience for me to write, and how I got through the sort of like those the death scenes there, I would bring myself to tears, and then I would start writing. And I could bring myself to tears by just like, I look in the mirror until I could start crying, and I would handwrite those scenes. You don't have to do that for everything, but do think about sort of what you're feeling as you're writing it, because that will come through on the page.
Well, I just want to comment. Thank you for that, John, because I know when I'm writing and I feel emotional, sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe I'm not writing what I'm supposed to be or whatever, but just let the heart go, right? So just let it be.
Well, I think honestly, the same patterns that created that feeling inside you are probably coming through in the words that are coming out. And yes, you may need to go through and tweak some things, but I will say that from the big, my experience with Big Fish and other things too, but especially Big Fish, like, people would read the script and like have to put it down because they couldn't read it anymore because it was so overwhelming. And it's what happens on the page, but it's really just, it's the flow of the words on the page that get you to that point, because it's just a series of images that sort of get you there. And it's a real thing. And we've all read books where it's like, wow, like it had that emotional impact on you. I strongly suspect it had that emotional impact on the author as they were putting those words down there.
Thank you for that. We have two more questions. Sure. Clay says, how do you know when it's time to stop tinkering on a piece and share it with someone to read?
I would say at a certain point, you're going to recognize, like, okay, I'm kind of moving the commas around. Like, I'm not really doing, I'm not addressing things that I feel are major concerns to me. I'm just sort of like trying to polish some stuff. That's a point where you need to put it in someone else's hands to read and let them sort of see what they're getting out of it, because you stop becoming an objective viewer of it. And everyone's going to find, who their best first readers are. And part of the process of going through NaNoWriMo is discovering who in your orbit is a really helpful reader to you. And so don't be discouraged if the first person who reads your thing doesn't love it, because they may not be the right reader for you. You'll find it. And so share it. And it could be another writer, but it could be somebody who doesn't, write at all.
And Ravin says, when the story doesn't really end in your mind, how do you know how to get to the end? How do you know what is the end?
Great. Well, a lot of stories don't have natural ends. If you think about probably most of the TV shows you've loved, they didn't have an end. They eventually the show ended, but like part of how TV works is that it keeps going, and it's this cycle that sort of keeps generating new story and things going forward. But for your book or for a movie, yeah, you want some sense of what an end is, that you're building up to a thing and that you've reached that point. So if you're in the middle of it right now and you're like, I don't know how this ends, this might be a moment to sort of stop and think, okay, what questions do I want to answer by the end of this story? Like where is the edge of this specific book, this specific adventure, this specific case, this specific tale that I'm telling? Why would this book end at a certain point? And think about, okay, well, how do I get to that ending? And do I need to change anything earlier on to set up in the audience's, the reader's mind, like, okay, when this thing occurs, that will be the end. So it can be as simple as, if it feels like this is a journey, then say like where that journey is taking them to, and if they get to that place, it feels like, okay, that's at least the physical end of the story. If it's about achieving a certain goal, then okay, name that goal early enough in the story that we know that when we get to that point, okay, it's the end of this part of it. Doesn't mean that the character's over and done. You can't tell more stories with them, but it's closure to this part of the story.
Thanks, John. I think that's going to be great. Do you have any last words for the Nano community?
Yeah, I think if people are have never done it before and they're just curious about trying it, definitely try it. Like the stakes could not be lower. So if all you end up doing is writing 5,000 words, great. If you've never written any sort of chaptery kind of stuff, great. Now you've written some chaptery kind of stuff. So definitely have fun with it. It should only be for the joy of it. That doesn't mean it's all going to be happy and good. It kind of sucks to sort of do that hard work at times, but don't think about this as being homework you assigned yourself. Think of this as being an opportunity, a privilege that you get to do this thing, that you get to sort of carve out some space and time to do this thing and build something new rather than just consuming. So definitely take it as like the luxury it is to be able to tell a story and find something that's new there out in the world.
That's great. And so for anyone who's sort of on the fence about doing NaNoWriMo, you can go to NaNoWriMo.org and check out the pages there to see what it's all about. And you can sign up your project there. And if you do decide to do it, Nano LA has a kickoff event on Sunday, October 23rd from 2 to 4 p.m. And it's going to be at Tongu Park in Santa Monica. As a writer, we like to hide away in our little offices. Maybe we're a little introverted, but this is an opportunity to come out, see the fellow Nano LA writers, and make a few friends who may work their way into a critique group or be a cafe buddy or something like that. So I really encourage everyone to go to NaNoWriMo.org and click on the LA region to see some of the events that we're going to be doing. So again, thank you, John August, for talking to us. And, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, John.
Good writing, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.